The sun was setting over Atlanta's busy streets as Special Agent Kendra Williams guided her dark blue Honda Civic through the familiar route home. Her blazer was draped over the passenger seat, and her FBI badge hung heavily around her neck after what felt like the longest Tuesday in recent memory. The case files from a complex money laundering investigation were still swimming in her head when she noticed the red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror. Really? Today of all days? She mumbled to herself, already going through her mental checklist. She knew she'd made a complete stop at the intersection. It was muscle memory after 15 years in law enforcement. Still, she did everything by the book, turned on the interior light, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and waited patiently. Through her side mirror, she watched the police officer approach. Something about his walk made her stomach tighten, the way he swaggered, hand already resting on his weapon holster. She'd seen that body language before, both as an FBI agent and as a black woman who'd grown up in America. The officer, his nameplate read Barrett, tapped on her window with his flashlight, even though the interior light was already on. Kendra pressed the button to lower her window, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "License and registration," Officer Barrett barked, not even bothering with the usual good evening that most officers use to start a traffic stop. "Of course, officer," Kendra replied, her voice steady and professional. "I'm going to reach for my credentials now. I'm actually a federal agent." "Did I ask what you do?" Barrett cut her off, his flashlight beam shifting aggressive from her face to her hands and back. "License and registration, now." Kendra felt her heart rate pick up, not from fear, but from the familiar frustration of these situations. She'd been on both sides of the badge. She'd trained officers on proper procedure. This wasn't it. "Sir, I'm reaching for my FBI credentials and identification." She moved her right hand slowly toward the center console where she kept her creds, making sure every movement was telegraphed. Barrett's hand tightened on his weapon. "Step out of the vehicle." "Officer, I'm a federal agent. If you'll allow me to show you my credentials." "Out of the vehicle now." Barrett had drawn his weapon, pointing it at Kendra through the window. "Hands where I can see them." In that moment, time seemed to slow down. Kendra's training kicked in, not just her FBI training, but the lifetime of lessons every black parent teaches their children about encounters with law enforcement. She could feel her phone in her pocket, knew she needed to get it recording, but first she had to de-escalate. "I am complying, officer," she said clearly, knowing her dashcam was recording everything. "I'm going to unlock my door now. My hands are visible. I'm not reaching for anything." As she carefully opened the door, she could hear Barrett calling for backup, reporting a suspicious individual claiming to be FBI. The irony might have been funny if it wasn't so dangerous. The cool evening air hit her face as she stepped out, hands raised. Other cars were slowing down as they passed, a few people already pulling out phones to record. Good, she thought. The more witnesses, the better. "Face the vehicle, hands on the hood," Barrett shouted, his voice carrying the edge of someone who'd already decided how this situation was going to play out. As Kendra followed his instructions, she began to catalog every detail: his badge number, the time, the cross streets, the witnesses. She was no longer just an FBI agent being harassed, she was gathering evidence. Because that's what good agents do, even when they're the ones being wronged. She could hear more sirens approaching in the distance. This was about to get more complicated, but Kendra knew one thing for certain. This stop wasn't about a stop sign. It was about power, prejudice, and a system that needed changing. And maybe, just maybe, she was exactly the right person to be in this situation right now. As she stood there, hands pressed against her car's cooling hood, Kendra began to formulate a plan. This officer had no idea that his biggest mistake wasn't racially profiling someone, it was racially profiling someone who knew exactly how to fight back through proper channels. Someone who understood the system from the inside out. The backup units were getting closer now, their sirens growing louder. Kendra took a deep breath, centering herself. The night was far from over, but she was already thinking ahead to the changes this incident could bring about. Sometimes the most important battles found you when you were just trying to drive home. The backup units arrived with a chorus of sirens and flashing lights, turning the quiet suburban street into something that looked like a crime scene. 3 additional patrol cars pulled up, their headlights creating long shadows across the pavement. Kendra remained perfectly still, her hands still planted firmly on her car's hood, watching the scene unfold in her side mirror. "What's the situation?" called out one of the arriving officers, a heavy-set man who looked to be in his mid-50s. Officer Barrett kept his weapon trained on Kendra while responding. Subject claims to be FBI. No credentials shown. Combative and uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. Kendra couldn't help but shake her head slightly at the blatant lie. She'd been nothing but cooperative, and Barrett had never given her the chance to show her credentials. She took a slow, deep breath, remembering her training instructor's words. Sometimes the hardest part of the job is keeping your cool when everything around you is chaos. "Officer," she called out clearly, making sure her voice carried to the newly arrived backup. "I am Special Agent Kendra Williams with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My credentials are in my center console. I've been attempting to show them since the beginning of this stop." One of the new officers, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, stepped forward. "Barrett, why don't you let me talk to her?" "Stay back," Barrett snapped, his voice carrying an edge of something that sounded like panic mixed with anger. She could be armed. "I am armed," Kendra stated calmly, "because I am a federal agent. My service weapon is holstered at my right hip. I have not reached for it or made any threatening movements. Everything that has happened here is recorded on my dashboard camera and likely on Officer Barrett's body cam as well." The female officer, her nameplate read Thompson, exchanged glances with the older officer. Something in their expressions shifted. They'd dealt with enough real criminals to know this wasn't adding up. "Ma'am," Officer Thompson said, taking another step forward despite Barrett's obvious displeasure, "would you be willing to let me approach and check your credentials?" "Of course," Kendra replied, maintaining her position. "They're in my center console. I'd also have my FBI supervisor's direct number if you'd like to verify my identity that way." Barrett's grip on his weapon tightened. She could have fake credentials. This could all be a setup. The older officer finally stepped in, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Barrett, lower your weapon. This isn't how we handle these situations." But Barrett wasn't backing down. Sweat had started to bead on his forehead, visible in the harsh streetlights. "You don't understand." She ran a stop sign, then started making claims about being FBI. For all we know, she could be part of those sovereign citizen groups. Kendra almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. A sovereign citizen with an FBI badge? But she kept her composure, knowing every word and action was being recorded. This was quickly becoming a textbook example of how implicit bias could cloud an officer's judgment. Officer Thompson had made her way to the passenger side of Kendra's car, peering in through the window with her flashlight. "I can see a federal badge case in the console," she reported. "Sir, I really think we need to verify her credentials." More cars were slowing down now, some people parking across the street to watch. Phone cameras glowed in the growing darkness like fireflies. Kendra knew this scene. A black woman surrounded by police, hands on a car, would look bad on social media. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Sometimes change needed witnesses. "Officer Barrett," Kendra said, her voice steady and clear, "I understand you're in a difficult position now. But escalating this situation isn't going to help anyone. Let's handle this professionally. Allow your colleague to verify my credentials, and we can all go home safely tonight." She could see Barrett's internal struggle playing across his face. His hand was still on his weapon, but the certainty had drained from his posture. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he might have made a serious mistake. The older officer stepped closer to Barrett, speaking in low tones that Kendra could barely hear. "Think about what you're doing, son. If she really is FBI, this is going to be a nightmare. Let's verify her credentials and sort this out properly." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. More patrol cars were arriving, probably drawn by the unusual amount of radio chatter. Kendra stayed perfectly still, knowing that the next few moments would be crucial. She'd seen situations like this go badly, had investigated the aftermath of similar scenes that ended in tragedy. But she wasn't just trying to survive this encounter, she was gathering evidence. Every overreaction, every refused request to check her credentials, every moment Barrett kept his weapon drawn despite no threat, it was all building a case. not just against one officer, but against a system that allowed these situations to happen far too often. As she waited for Barrett to make his decision, Kendra's mind was already racing ahead to what would come next. Because one way or another, this night was going to lead to change. The only question was how much resistance that change would meet along the way. The standoff finally broke when a black SUV with federal government plates came screaming around the corner, lights flashing. Kendra recognized it immediately, her supervisor's vehicle. She'd managed to press her phone's emergency contact button during the initial stop, sending her location to both her supervisor and the FBI office. Assistant Director Chen stepped out of the SUV, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was still wearing his suit from the office, his FBI badge prominently displayed around his neck. The local officer's attention immediately shifted, creating a new tension in the air. Would someone like to explain why one of my agents is being held at gunpoint? Chen's voice cut through the night air like a knife. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. 20 years of federal law enforcement experience carried in every word. Officer Barrett's weapon finally lowered, though his hand remained on it. Sir, we had a situation with an uncooperative. I've been watching the last 10 minutes on her dashcam feed, Chen interrupted, holding up his phone. Agent Williams activated her emergency protocol. Everything's been streaming to our office. Now, Officer Barrett, would you like to try that explanation again? The color drained from Barrett's face. He hadn't known about the dashcam, hadn't realized that his every action and word had been transmitted to the FBI in real time. Kendra remained still, but a small sense of satisfaction settled in her chest. Technology, when used properly, had a way of revealing truth. Agent Williams, Chen called out, "Are you all right?" "Yes, sir," Kendra responded clearly. "Though I'd very much like to show my credentials now, if Officer Barrett will finally allow it." Officer Thompson, who had been standing by Kendra's car, spoke up. "Sir, I can see her FBI credentials in the console. We've been trying to verify them, but Officer Barrett wouldn't allow it," Chen finished. He turned to the older local officer who seemed to be the ranking person on scene. "I'm assuming you're in charge here." The older officer stepped forward, his nameplate catching the light. "Captain Reynolds." "Yes, sir. And I want to apologize for this situation. We'll be launching an internal investigation immediately." "Oh, there'll be more than an internal investigation," Chen replied. "Now can we allow Agent Williams to step away from her vehicle and properly identify herself? Or do I need to make some calls to get the Attorney General's office involved?" Finally, Barrett holstered his weapon completely. The change in his demeanor was dramatic, from aggressive authority to someone who realized they might have just ended their career. Kendra slowly straightened up from the car, her back stiff from being bent over for so long. "Officer Thompson," she said calmly, "would you please retrieve my credentials from the console?" Thompson quickly got the credentials and brought them over, handing them first to Captain Reynolds, who examined them before passing them to Chen. It was all ceremonial at this point. Chen obviously knew who she was, but procedure mattered. Everything needed to be documented properly. "These appear to be in order," Reynolds said, his voice heavy with the understanding of just how badly this situation had spiraled. "Agent Williams, you're free to go. We'll need statements from everyone involved, of course." "Oh, you'll get statements," Chen assured him. "Along with the dash cam footage, body cam footage, and about 30 civilian videos I can see being recorded right now. But first, Agent Williams, and I need to file some immediate paperwork." Kendra walked over to join her supervisor, her legs slightly shaky but her head held high. As she passed Barrett, she paused for just a moment. "Officer Barrett," she said quietly, "I hope you learn from this. The next person you profile might not have a dash cam or an FBI supervisor on speed dial." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their phones still recording everything. Some were live streaming, others posting to social media. By morning, this would be everywhere. But Kendra wasn't thinking about viral videos or social media outrage. She was thinking about documentation, procedures, and the slow, methodical work of creating real change. "You okay?" Chen asked quietly as they walked to his SUV. "I'm fine," Kendra replied, then added with a hint of determination, "but I want to handle this one personally. Not just the complaint. Everything. There's something bigger here, and I want to follow it through. Chen nodded, understanding in his eyes. Already got the paperwork started. We'll need to call the Civil Rights Division, get statements processed tonight while everything's fresh. He paused, then added, you know this is going to be a lot of work, right? These cases always are. Kendra looked back at the scene, the police cars with their lights still flashing, Officer Barrett standing defeated by his patrol car, the crowd of witnesses with their phones raised high. Yeah, she said, but some things are worth the effort. Sometimes you have to be the change you want to see. As they drove away from the scene, Kendra began mentally preparing for what was to come. The interviews, the paperwork, the inevitable resistance from the police union. But she also thought about the future, about other traffic stops that wouldn't end this way, about better training programs, about real accountability. Sometimes the worst nights led to the most important mornings. The next morning, the Internal Affairs Office of the Atlanta Police Department looked like a beehive that had been knocked over. Phones were ringing nonstop, people were rushing through hallways with stacks of papers, and every TV in the building was showing different news channels, all playing the same cell phone videos from last night. Kendra sat in a conference room, her FBI badge on the table in front of her, watching the chaos through the glass walls. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night writing her official statement and reviewing the dashed cam footage. Her phone had blown up with messages from family and friends who'd seen the videos online, but she'd only responded to one. Her mom's simple text asking if she was okay. Agent Williams. A voice pulled her attention to the door. I'm Lieutenant Cooper from Internal Affairs. Thank you for coming in so early. Kendra nodded, taking in the lieutenant's appearance. She was probably in her late 40s, with silver streaks in her dark hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from years of investigating other police officers. That wasn't an easy job in any department. The footage has been downloaded from both your dash cam and Officer Barrett's body camera. Cooper said, setting a thick folder on the table. But I'd like to hear everything in your own words from the beginning. Before we start, Kendra said, pulling out her own notebook, I'd like to discuss something I found last night. After I got home, I did some preliminary research into Officer Barrett's record. Cooper's eyebrows rose slightly. You had access to his records? No, Kendra smiled slightly, but I had access to public records, social media, and civilian complaint databases. It's amazing what people post online these days. And I found some interesting patterns. She opened her notebook, revealing pages of notes and printed screenshots. In the past 3 years, there have been 17 civilian complaints about Officer Barrett's conduct during traffic stops. 15 of those complaints came from minority drivers. None of them resulted in any disciplinary action. Cooper's face remained neutral, but her hands tightened slightly on her pen. Those complaints were investigated by different investigators using different standards, with no one looking at the overall pattern, Kendra finished. I'm not here just to file another complaint, Lieutenant. I'm here to address a systemic issue. The lieutenant was quiet for a moment, then reached for her phone. I think we need to bring some other people into this conversation. Over the next hour, the conference room filled up. The police chief arrived, followed by representatives from the city's legal department and the police union. Kendra's supervisor, Chen, showed up with 2 attorneys from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The small conference room was suddenly feeling very crowded. Kendra walked them through everything, not just from last night, but the patterns she'd uncovered. She pulled up social media posts where Barrett had shared questionable content about minorities. She showed statistics about his traffic stops compared to other officers in his precinct. With each piece of evidence, the room grew quieter. This isn't just about one bad traffic stop, she explained, her voice firm but not accusatory. This is about a system that allowed these incidents to pile up without anyone connecting the dots. How many other officers have similar patterns that we're not seeing because we're looking at each complaint in isolation? The police chief leaned forward, his face grave. What exactly are you proposing, Agent Williams? A complete overhaul of how we handle these investigations, Kendra replied, pulling out a preliminary proposal she'd drafted in the early hours of the morning. New software to track patterns across complaints. Better integration between departments. Mandatory review triggers when complaints hit certain thresholds. And most importantly, a new training program that addresses implicit bias not just in theory, but in practical, real-world situations. That's a lot of changes. The union representative started to protest, but the chief held up his hand. No, he said quietly. She's right. We've been playing whack-a-mole with these incidents for too long. Every time a video goes viral, we react. But we're not preventing the next video, the next incident, the next tragedy waiting to happen. Kendra watched as the room absorbed this. She could see the wheels turning, the mental calculations being made. Change was expensive, change was difficult, change meant admitting there were problems to fix. But the alternative, waiting until something worse happened, was even more costly. The FBI would be willing to assist with implementing these changes, Chen added, nodding to Kendra. Agent Williams has experience in training and systems analysis. We could make this a pilot program, something that could be replicated in other departments if it proves successful. The meeting stretched into the afternoon. More people were called in, more questions were asked, more details were hammered out. But through it all, Kendra kept coming back to one thought. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best opportunities for change. As the sun started to set, casting long shadows through the conference room windows, the chief signed off on the preliminary proposal. It wasn't a complete victory. There would be months of work ahead, committees to convince, budgets to arrange. But it was a start. You know, Lieutenant Cooper said as they were packing up, when I came in this morning, I thought we were just handling another complaint. I didn't expect to be redesigning our entire approach to internal investigations. Kendra smiled, gathering her notes. Sometimes the best changes come from unexpected places. We just have to be ready to seize the moment when it arrives. As she walked out of the building, her phone buzzed with another news alert about last night's incident. But now, instead of feeling frustrated, she felt hopeful. Real change didn't come from viral videos or public outrage. It came from people willing to sit in conference rooms for hours, working through the boring details of policy changes and training programs. It came from turning bad moments into better systems. The hard work was just beginning, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like they were finally moving in the right direction. 3 weeks after the traffic stop incident, Kendra's office looked like something from a TV crime drama. The walls were covered with photos, timelines, and sticky notes. Her computer screens displayed spreadsheets full of data, and stacks of files covered every flat surface. "Your office is giving me anxiety," Chen said from the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Kendra, who was deep in thought, staring at her evidence wall. "Thanks," she said, taking a sip. "But look at this pattern I found. It's bigger than we thought." She pointed to a series of photos and documents. "Remember those 17 complaints against Barrett? Well, I started looking into the officers he trained with, the ones who went through the academy in his class. Guess what I found?" Chen moved closer to the wall, his eyes scanning the documents. Similar complaint patterns. "Exactly," Kendra said, standing up to point at different sections of her wall. Out of the 30 officers in that academy class, 12 of them share the same pattern of discriminatory stops. They all had the same training officers, the same supervisors during their probationary period. She walked over to her computer and pulled up a map covered in colored dots. "Look at this. Red dots are problematic stops by Barrett. Blue dots are stops by other officers from his academy class. Yellow dots are stops by officers they later trained. It's like watching bad habits spread through the department." Chen whistled softly. "It's like tracing the spread of a virus." "More like tracking the spread of a mindset," Kendra corrected. These officers were taught these behaviors, either directly or indirectly. And then they passed them on to the officers they trained. She pulled out another file, this one filled with training materials. "I went through the academy curriculum from when Barrett's class went through. Guess how many hours were dedicated to community relations and bias recognition?" "How many?" 4 hours, Kendra said, shaking her head. 4 hours out of 6 months of training. And it was all theoretical, just PowerPoint presentations and outdated videos. No real-world scenarios, no practical exercises, no follow-up training. She walked back to her evidence wall, taking another sip of coffee. But here's the really interesting part. I started looking at departments across the country that have successfully reduced discriminatory incidents. Know what they all have in common? Chen smiled slightly. "I have a feeling you're about to tell me." Continuous training, Kendra said, pulling out another set of documents. Not just during the academy, but throughout their careers. Regular workshops, community involvement programs, real-world scenario training. And most importantly, they all have systems in place to identify and address problematic patterns before they become ingrained behaviors. She pointed to a particular section of her wall where photos of successful programs were displayed. This department in Oregon reduced their discriminatory incident complaints by 65% in 2 years. This one in Michigan cut theirs in half. And look at what they did in Colorado. I get it, Chen interrupted gently. You found a way forward. But Kendra, changing an entire department's training program isn't going to be easy. There's going to be resistance. Kendra nodded, turning to face her supervisor. I know. That's why I've also been gathering success stories. Real examples of how these changes made officers' jobs easier, made communities safer, improved department morale. Because people don't change just because you tell them they're wrong. They change when you show them a better way. She walked over to her desk and picked up a thick binder. This is my preliminary report. It's not just about Barrett anymore. It's about how departments can identify and correct these issues before they lead to viral videos and damaged relationships with the community. Chen took the binder, flipping through it. His eyebrows rose as he saw the depth of research, the carefully documented patterns, the proposed solutions backed by real-world examples. You know, he said slowly, when you said you wanted to handle this personally, I thought you meant filing charges against Barrett. This is much bigger. Barrett is just a symptom, Kendra replied, turning back to her evidence wall. If we want real change, we need to address the root causes. And yes, that means some officers will face consequences for their actions. But more importantly, it means creating a system that prevents these incidents from happening in the first place. She picked up another file, this one containing interviews with officers who'd gone through reformed training programs. These officers talk about how better training made them feel more confident, more prepared. How understanding bias made their jobs easier, not harder. That's the story we need to tell. Chen nodded slowly, still flipping through the report. You're not just building a case. You're building a roadmap for change. Exactly, Kendra said, a small smile crossing her face. Because sometimes the best way to fight injustice isn't just to punish the wrong actions, it's to make it easier for people to do the right thing. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through her office window, Kendra looked at her evidence wall one more time. Tomorrow, she would present her findings to a joint committee of department heads and city officials. It wouldn't be an easy conversation, but she was ready, because sometimes the hardest conversations were the ones most worth having. The police academy's main training room buzzed with nervous energy. 60 officers, both veterans and rookies, filled the seats, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. At the front of the room, Kendra adjusted the microphone, taking a deep breath. 3 months ago, I was pulled over on my way home from work, she began, her voice steady. Today, I'm here to talk about how that traffic stop is changing the way we think about police training. She clicked her remote, bringing up the first slide of her presentation. It wasn't the dash cam footage everyone had seen online. Instead, it was a simple graph showing police community trust ratings over the past decade. We're not here to point fingers or assign blame, she continued. We're here to talk about solutions, real practical solutions that will make your jobs easier and our communities safer. A hand went up in the back. With all due respect, Agent Williams, we've had diversity training before. How is this different? Kendra smiled. She'd been expecting this question. Officer Rodriguez, right? 23 traffic stops last month, 0 complaints, and your body cam footage shows consistent professional conduct. Would you mind telling everyone how you handle traffic stops? Rodriguez looked surprised but stood up. Well, I try to be clear about why I pulled someone over. I explain what I'm doing and why. Basic stuff, really. Basic stuff that works, Kendra said. But did anyone ever teach you those specific techniques in the academy, or did you figure them out through trial and error? The room was quiet as officers looked at each other, realizing how much of their daily conduct came from personal experience rather than formal training. Today, we're not just going to talk about what to do, Kendra explained, clicking to the next slide. We're going to practice it. We're going to break down real situations, analyze what works and what doesn't, and develop specific techniques that you can use tomorrow on your patrol. Over the next 4 hours, Kendra led them through a series of exercises. They analyzed body cam footage from successful and problematic stops. They role-played different scenarios, with officers taking turns playing both roles. They discussed specific words and phrases that could escalate or de-escalate situations. Notice how Officer Lee handled that situation, Kendra pointed out during one role-play. She explained what she was doing before she did it. She maintained a professional tone without being robotic. These aren't just feel-good techniques, they're practical tools that protect both the officer and the civilian. During the lunch break, several officers lingered to ask questions. One veteran officer approached Kendra with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "I've been on the force for 20 years. Thought I knew everything about traffic stops, but watching these scenarios, seeing how small changes in approach can make such a big difference, it's eye-opening." Kendra nodded. "That's exactly what we're aiming for. Small changes that add up to big results." The afternoon session focused on the new tracking system she helped develop. Each officer would now have access to a dashboard showing their stop statistics, complaint patterns, and positive feedback from the community. "This isn't about catching you doing something wrong," Kendra explained as she demonstrated the system. "It's about giving you tools to track your own performance and identify areas for improvement. Think of it like a fitness tracker for your professional conduct." She pulled up an anonymous officer's dashboard. "See these patterns?" This officer noticed they were getting more complaints during night shifts. They adjusted their approach, started using clearer communication, and their complaint rate dropped to 0. That's the kind of self-awareness we're trying to build. As the training session wrapped up, Kendra could feel the shift in the room. The initial skepticism had given way to engagement. Officers were talking among themselves, sharing experiences, discussing how they could apply these techniques to their daily work. "Remember," she said in her closing remarks, "this isn't just about avoiding complaints or bad publicity. It's about making your jobs safer and more effective. When community trust goes up, cooperation increases. When cooperation increases, we all do our jobs better." After the session, Chen was waiting outside. "How'd it go?" "Better than expected," Kendra replied, gathering her materials. They were really engaged, especially during the practical exercises. One officer told me it was the first training he'd had that felt directly applicable to his daily work. "The chief wants to expand the program," Chen said. "Other departments are asking about it too. Word's getting around about what we're doing here." Kendra smiled, remembering that night 3 months ago. "You know what the best part is? Officer Barrett's old patrol area has had 0 complaints about discriminatory stops since the new training program started. The new officer they assigned there is using all the techniques we're teaching." As they walked to their cars, Chen looked at her curiously. "Do you ever regret not just filing a simple complaint that night? This has turned into a lot of work." Kendra thought about all the hours she'd put in, all the research, all the resistance she'd overcome. Then she thought about the officers in today's training, eager to learn better ways to do their jobs. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Sometimes the longest path is the one that leads to real change." 1 year later, Kendra stood at the podium in the Atlanta Police Department's main conference hall. The room was packed with officers, city officials, and media representatives. Behind her, a large screen displayed impressive statistics about the department's transformation over the past year. "When I started this journey," she began, adjusting the microphone, "it wasn't about one traffic stop or one officer. It was about creating lasting change. Today, I'm proud to share what we've accomplished together." She clicked to the first slide, showing a dramatic drop in civilian complaints. In the past year, complaints about discriminatory conduct have decreased by 78%. But more importantly, positive community feedback has increased by 165%. The room buzzed with approving murmurs. Kendra spotted Officer Rodriguez in the crowd, now wearing sergeant's stripes. He'd become one of the program's biggest supporters, helping to train other officers in the new techniques. "But numbers only tell part of the story," Kendra continued. "The real success is in the daily interactions that never make the news. The traffic stops that end with handshakes instead of handcuffs. The community meetings where residents and officers work together to solve problems." She clicked to the next slide, showing a series of photos from community events. Officers playing basketball with local kids, attending neighborhood meetings, participating in cultural awareness workshops. Our training program has become a model for departments across the country, she explained. Last month, we hosted officers from 12 different states who came to learn our methods. Next month, we're launching an online platform to share our resources with departments nationwide. In the front row, Chief Thompson nodded approvingly. He'd been skeptical at first, but the results had made him a strong advocate for the program. Next to him sat Lieutenant Cooper from Internal Affairs, who'd helped implement many of the new tracking systems. But perhaps the most significant change, Kendra said, clicking to a new slide, is in officer satisfaction rates. Our surveys show that 89% of officers report feeling better equipped to handle difficult situations. 92% say they feel more confident in their daily interactions with the public. She paused, letting that sink in. This was never about making officers' jobs harder. It was about giving them better tools, better training, and better support. A young officer raised her hand during the Q&A session. Agent Williams, what happened to Officer Barrett? The room grew quiet. Everyone knew the story that had started it all, but few knew how it had ended. Officer Barrett resigned from the force, Kendra answered honestly. But before he left, he did something unexpected. He wrote a letter to the department acknowledging his mistakes and supporting the new training program. His experience became a teaching tool in our course on bias recognition. She clicked to another slide, showing the department's new training center. Which brings me to our next announcement. The FBI has approved funding for a national training center here in Atlanta. Starting next year, we'll be able to train officers from across the country in these new techniques. The room erupted in applause. Chen, sitting in the back, gave her a thumbs up. He'd helped secure the funding, believing that what they'd built in Atlanta could help transform departments nationwide. But our work isn't done, Kendra continued once the applause died down. Change isn't a destination, it's a journey. We need to keep evolving, keep learning, keep improving. Each interaction is a chance to build trust, to show professionalism, to make our communities safer. She clicked to a final slide, showing a simple photo of a police car's lights reflected in a rearview mirror. A year ago, I was pulled over on my way home from work. That moment could have ended in many ways. But because of the choices we made, all of us, it became the beginning of something important. After the presentation, officers and officials crowded around, asking questions and sharing their own stories of transformation. A veteran officer approached Kendra with tears in his eyes. You know, he said quietly, I've been on the force for 30 years. Never thought I'd see changes like this. My grandson just entered the academy, and knowing he'll be trained this way from the start, it means everything. Later that evening, as Kendra packed up her materials, Chen joined her. Quite a year, he said, helping her gather her papers. Yeah, she smiled, looking around the now empty conference room. But you know what makes me happiest? Last week, I got pulled over on my way home. Chen raised an eyebrow. Really? Yep. Young officer, probably fresh out of our new training program. He was professional, courteous, explained everything he was doing. When I showed him my FBI credentials, he handled it perfectly. No drama, no tension, just a routine stop conducted with respect and professionalism. That's what success looks like, Chen nodded. Exactly, Kendra said, picking up her briefcase. Real change isn't about big moments or dramatic confrontations. It's about all the small moments that go right instead of wrong. It's about making the right way the normal way. As they walked out of the building, the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Kendra thought about how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. But for the first time in a long time, the path forward was clear. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. And sometimes the best response to injustice isn't just to fight it, it's to transform it into something better.